All right, everyone. Welcome to another webinar. Hope you're doing well today. I'm going to launch a poll if everyone can take part in it. Really appreciate it. I always like to know who's in the audience as we get going here. For those of you who don't know, or actually, let's introduce ourselves first before I introduce myself. So throw your name in the chat, where you're from. Always appreciate to see where people are coming from. And of course, if you could answer that poll question, we are going to have a crowded webinar today. Good thing it's virtual space, because man, I thought the last webinar had a lot of people on it with the core. This one, we had a lot of interest in shoulder. So a lot of coaches and swimmers. Okay, we had much more coach heavy the last webinar. So pretty even, almost coaches, swimmers. That's awesome. And as always, we'll have Q&A at the end. So feel free to drop your questions in at the end. Once I get into presentation mode, I'm not going to be checking the chat. So best to leave your questions till I then open up for Q&A at the end. But appreciate everyone introducing themselves, where they're from as we get going. I am Chris Ritter. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a swim and strength coach, CEO of Ritter Sports Performance, created the Surge Strength Academy and our Dryland programs. And actually, I would like to do our next poll here. See how many of you, is this your first Surge Strength webinar? Welcome to everyone that is new. Oh, wow, a lot of new people. All right, that's an awesome percentage. Welcome all. Excited to be here. Wow, yeah, this is a good number of first timers. Thank you guys for always participating in the polls. Always helpful for me to kind of steer the direction of the presentation, knowing who's out there. Wow, yeah, good. I can't remember the last time we've had a webinar with this many new people, so welcome. It's exciting. All right, and then here's another question for you, especially new people. Have you registered yet for a free Dryland 101 course in the Surge Strength Academy? If not, why not? It's free. We have Dryland courses for coaches, swimmers, parents, all that you need to know to get started on Dryland. Obviously, we're doing a lot of webinars of late. We just recorded another podcast actually earlier this morning that we'll be releasing soon. Really awesome testimonial from a young lady. Excuse me. She's going into college next fall and just really blew up with the strength training that we were able to give her Dryland program the last year and a half. So that's awesome. So those of you that haven't been in the Surge Strength Academy yet, after the webinar, make sure you register for free. And of course, I already was mentioning the podcast we were recording earlier with one of our swimmers that we're working with, and our Dryland programs, working with people in a lot of countries around the world, and of course, a lot locally here in the States. And we just keep getting results. So obviously something's working. All right. And so the last poll I want to get to before I actually start is on the issue of today, shoulder health for swimmers. So tell me, have you had a shoulder issue, however you want to define that, that interfered with your swimming? Wow. Okay. 4 lucky people in the audience, 6, 7. Everybody else said shoulder issues. Oh, unfortunately, not surprising. All right, so we got 8 people that have made it through, guys, in our audience without shoulder issues. Everybody else has had some kind of shoulder issue that has interfered with their swimming. Never a fun thing. I know I've experienced it. It actually knocked me out of my whole season swimming high school. I was basically relegated to kicking for most of the season. Really affected my career. And so we're trying at Surge Strength to make sure that you don't have to deal with that kind of stuff, that we'll give you the tools. And this webinar is part of it. So let's jump in. So we're going to start teaching now. So hold your questions, Q&A. I'm not going to be checking that until at the end. So if we can go ahead and tune in. Now, I was thinking of, and the poll proved it out, that most people have had shoulder injuries. So we're not going to title it the negative thing, shoulder injuries. We're actually focusing on shoulder health. How do we get past that? But I will say this right off the bat. It's really important to understand the difference between pain and discomfort, especially when we're talking about something dealing with shoulders. So pain is typically something in a joint. It's a very sharp feeling. It's usually associated with bad technique, or you're really, really tired. You need to stop stuff like that immediately and go to a certified therapist, doctor, whoever your primary healthcare provider is, and check that out. Discomfort, on the other hand, is usually more located in the muscle, and it's more a dull, burning feeling. You usually have good technique even with discomfort, and the fatigue usually isn't as severe, and you work through that. But I just want to make sure, kind of put out those disclaimers. And again, if you are experiencing shoulder pain, make sure you see someone in your area that can check it out. So we're not relegated or going into that world of pain because we're not certified physical therapists or athletic trainers, anything like that. We're just Dryland certified coaches trying to help swimmers get better. So I want to just say that off of the jump here. So let's get into it. Shoulder health for swimmers. And this is how I'm going to break it down in the presentation today, is how we can get shoulder health is by first optimal mobility. So not necessarily increasing mobility. Some of you may have too much mobility. So that's why I put optimal mobility. And then same thing with strength. Now I'm guessing if I had to pick in the audience, I bet most of you need strength and some of you are going to need more mobility, maybe more than others, but it's all about the optimal level. So it's not just automatically increasing mobility or increasing strength. And then there's definitely a programming component of it. As I was putting this all together, though, of course, I had way too many slides to fit in this time slot. So we're probably not going to get to the programming aspect of it. That would open up a whole nother webinar that would have to make sure everyone's up on speed, especially a lot of new people here. So we're going to really focus on optimal mobility and optimal strength, and giving you real examples, exercise you can start doing today for that. So let's jump in with the mobility here. So first off, you need to understand that mobility really dictates everything else that your body does. So if you have restrictions, if you have restricted range of motion, that's going to have trickle down effects. Now, of course, I'm not saying everybody needs to be in this position by the end of the webinar or even ever. That's not a prerequisite, but of course it is an extreme example. But movement's so important because we need a solid or a wide ranging, I would say, degrees freedom of movement that then we can build strength upon, that then we can build power and endurance off of. So movement's really where this all starts. And that's why we're talking mobility first, and then we'll get into the strength. And obviously when we're in the water, you get in some funky positions here, trying to get that high vertical forearm, good catch, which all the strokes really require at some point in the phases of the cycles. Having a good catch is important. And of course, the shoulder really ties into that. So if you have restrictions in your shoulder, it's going to be a lot harder to get into that catch position. Now, especially nowadays, I feel like there are much more diverse swimmers' bodies, if you will. It's not always the long, lengthy, tall swimmers like Tom Dolan and Tom Malchow. We've had a lot of short swimmers too, and it's not just related to the breaststroke as well, but there is commonality that I've seen in terms of successful swimmers. They need a high strength to mass ratio. So the pull-up is a great exercise that you can exhibit that, or you can see, oh, I need to improve this. In the previous webinar that we did a few weeks ago, and you can see the replay of that on our YouTube channel if you weren't able to attend, you need a strong core. So we really talked about that. And that's actually going to come up a little bit today. It ties in to shoulder health, believe it or not. And then lastly, you need mobility as a swimmer, especially in the shoulders, which is what we're going to be talking about as part of the presentation today. Now, I've already established this. There are 8 lucky of you in the audience right now. Everyone else has experienced some kind of shoulder issue. I'm sorry about that, but it's not surprising either. I've helped, young kids doing summer league for the first time, trying to figure out how do I get into jammers, stuff like that, all the way up to Olympic gold medalists and world record holders. Nobody wants to deal with injuries though, and especially with the shoulder, because if you can't swim, you can't get better, then you get frustrated, coach gets frustrated, or if you're a coach, you're frustrated, your swimmer can't get in the water, they can't improve, program isn't looking as good. It's just a whole thing that snowballs. And at Surge Strength, we really take this approach seriously, that we do not want to do harm, especially out of the water. That's probably the worst thing in my mind for a swimmer to get hurt not doing actual swimming, but doing something on land. And we'll talk a little bit about why that happens. And it's really because in dry land, the intensity is raised so much. Think about if you've been on any previous webinars, we talk about like rep ranges, right? Some exercise, we're only doing 2 to 5 reps of something. That's not a lot of time. So the intensity needs to be very high versus if you're swimming 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 yards in a practice, that's a lot of duration. And so the intensity obviously has to be much lower to get through all that. So in dry land, you have much smaller room to kind of navigate until you get into more of an injury zone. So when we think about something like the shoulder, if you have restrictions in terms of your movement, and now we add load and now we add intensity on top of that load, that's really why injuries creep up much more regularly with dry land. And it can be very sudden in dry land, right, too? Whereas swimming, typically with shoulder issues, it's almost like a slow burn, slow boil over time. And then you're like, oh yeah, my shoulder really does hurt. So for better, for worse, dryland seems to be a much more just boom, there it is, and swimming over time. But dryland can really make sure it inhibits injuries in the water. And honestly, part of it is just the inherent nature of swimming, right? We know it's so repetitive. How many arm strokes are you taking, even in a 5,000 yard practice? And here's the math of swimming to help you wrap your mind around that. So let's just say on average, you're taking 14 strokes a lap, even in 4,000 yard practice, relatively low yardage, especially if you're a senior or age group swimmer. 160 laps, you're already at 2,000 strokes. A week, 13,000. A year, we're almost at 750,000 strokes. So no wonder we start to end up with posture like this, right? With our swimmers, it's not hard to imagine. And even more, what if your technique is off a little bit in the pool? What if your shoulder just can't quite get there and maybe it's a little click or just a little catch every time? Well, that's going to build up really quick. You think about doing that 250,000 times. You do anything 250,000 times, just a little bit off, by the end, you're going to be really far off. So this is why those shoulder injuries can really creep up over time. So let's drill down into why do injuries happen and the couple ways or buckets that you could. Number one, poor technique. And this could be in the gym or in the pool, either one, right? If I have a really crossing my arm with the catch, or a lot of other ways you can have stroke normalities or abnormalities while you're swimming and just getting your shoulder in weird positions. But on land, the same thing applies. If you're doing the bench press sloppily, or you're not ready to do pull-ups and you're trying to push through, poor technique really contributes to injuries popping up. The other thing that's kind of programming related is too much too fast. So you're not having a steady long-term view of your progressions. You're just jumping into it and trying to go as hard as you can. That's often going to overload the body, and the weakest spot is usually going to cry out. And for a lot of people, that's their shoulders. And so that's why that will occur. The last one is what we're going to really focus on more in this presentation, is the imbalances, and especially in a joint like the shoulder. You typically find that the more a joint has movement, the more chances or the increased likelihood that you're going to have that restricted, simply because there's more range of motion to then restrict. You think about something like your knee, not a ton of range of motion, especially it's only mostly in one plane. And so you don't usually think of a lot of restrictions around knee movement, but shoulders, ankles, some of the most mobile joints in your body, there can be a lot of restrictions there, and injuries play a part in prolonging that as well. Now, I know myself, I went through this cycle as a swimmer. I watched swimmers that I coached go through this cycle. Sounds like a lot of you have gone through this cycle as well, especially answering that poll question about shoulder injuries. But tell me if you haven't heard this before, you experienced yourself. You get injured, okay, got to stop swimming. You go heal, maybe you go see a therapist, you rehab a little bit, then you start swimming. A few weeks go by, hopefully, maybe in a few months, then it comes back and we're right back to the same cycle. And it can be maddening. I've seen kids literally just have to quit the sport because they weren't able to break this cycle. And that's so sad, especially when it's a sport where I've seen people in their 90s doing this and enjoying it. And so this comes back to, it doesn't matter what level you're competing at, or even if you compete or not, I want you to be able to enjoy the water, especially pain-free at the shoulder. So the first thing we have to know is, where are we starting when it comes to mobility of the shoulder. So this is our shoulder mobility assessment. It's part of our onboarding process if you start a Surge Strength program with us. I'm going to walk you through what this looks like, and then we're all actually going to do it here real fast. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to take one arm underneath, the other arm over top, and you're going to try to touch your hands, but they're going to be in fists together. So even though the picture is a little inaccurate, we're going to keep them in fists. So here's a video of it. And it's whatever arm is underneath or behind you, that's the side we're actually measuring. So everybody just take their, hopefully you have some space. You could just do this real fast. Just take some time. Do your right arm behind you first, and then do your left arm. And see if there's much of a difference. Don't even worry about measuring it right now. I just want you to feel, is there a difference? And for most of you, I'm guessing, you're like, oh yeah, that side, ooh, it's a little tighter than the other. So that's just something to notice. So ideally, we want to see a score of 2 where it's relatively even on both sides and the fists are relatively close, even if they're not touching. That video we just saw, I would have scored it as a 2 on the left and a 1 on the right. So I'll show that video for you one more time so you can see. So remember, the left arm is behind, so that's the one we're grading. So you can see it's pretty close there. He's almost touching, but the right, you can really see there's some restrictions. So this is around the right shoulder, then that there are a little bit more restrictions, a little bit of issues. So we would automatically have to think about how we're going to alter our programming, play this along a little bit slower in terms of the programming, especially for exercises. I'm already getting ahead of myself, jumping through slides in my head. So that's just something to be aware of. So whether or not you noticed a big difference one-sided or the other, that's just something to be aware of with your training. So let's look at some movements and exercises that we can do to improve mobility around the shoulder. Because if you were to start a program with us and we go through the onboarding, we see, oh, you're scoring a 1 maybe on both sides or a 2 and a 1, we're definitely going to be putting exercises like this as a part of your program to do every day. I would do this before you jump in the water just to make sure. And there are different types of stretching, warm up. This one is specifically to increase range of motion. So we're not trying to elevate your body temperature or get you sweaty. This type of mobility work is all about increasing the range of motion, ROM. Okay. And these are some of my favorites specifically for the shoulder. We're not going to go through all of these videos because I really need to make sure I keep time on this webinar, but here's a couple. And there's these Eldoa series that I've recently come across. I really like. So this first one's the Eldoa A stretch, as I term it. And so you're sitting in kind of an A position with your knees there. And then you're just sitting up as tall as you can. And you're really thinking about lengthening your spine and sitting up as tall, no slouching. Then here's where it really starts. So you're going to twist your arm one way and then twist the arm the other. And you're almost thinking about pushing your wrist out in front of you while you're staying up tall. So if any of you are familiar with anatomy trains, Thomas Myers, things like that, we're able to figure out certain patterns and get the body in certain positions where it really has a very nice stretching effect. So you can see here, you'd maybe walk into the room or in a gym and see this and say, oh, what's he doing? It doesn't even look like anything. But that's actually a really effective stretch, especially for around the shoulder. Here's another Eldoa series, Eldoa B. So you start out in that position, but now I'm on my back, knees are up, legs are out. And this time, instead of the wrists, we're twisting our feet out. So you're thinking about that pinky toe, trying to go out as far as possible. And at the same time, lengthening your spine while you're on the ground. And then now here, we're going to go back, rotate the hands. You're trying to twist out, keep that palm as flat as possible. And these can be pretty intense. It doesn't look like much, but especially if you were having kind of any restrictions or problems getting into that shoulder mobility assessment you just did, you're going to feel these immediately. And we'll talk about what to do when you feel stuff like that while you're stretching in a little bit. Here's one more of this Eldoa series. This is Eldoa T. So we get in the B position, but now we go a little bit extra. So pinky toes are out, trying to twist, trying to keep the spine very long. That's the other thing about these Eldoa series is there's a lot of stuff you have to think about, even though there's not a lot of movement, really a lot of fine technique things. Then we twist the arms out. And now the finishing touches, we're going to reach the arms out to the side to finish making that T, all while keeping pinky toes out, wrists flat, externally rotate as much as possible. And now you're putting out your arms. And again, so it almost builds on each other. So if you were really tight when we were doing the shoulder mobility assessment, I would just maybe stick with the Eldoa A, maybe B. T is the most intense of all this because you could see it's kind of building on each other. And it all goes back to this idea that Thomas Myers Anatomy Train went through. Here's another one, not part of the Eldoa series, is the seated wall angel. And there's a couple variations of this depending on, again, how restricted you are. We can kind of make it easier or harder based on what we need to accomplish mobility-wise with your shoulder. But the essence is you get as close to the wall as possible. So you want your hips, even your butt, whatever is against the wall, all the way up through your shoulders, back of your head. So this can either be in a sitting, standing. We even can do some lying down on the ground if we really need to lower the intensity. And the whole point is similar to the Eldoas, not a lot. It doesn't look like a lot, but we're just trying to slide from our elbow to the back of our hand, keep that touching the wall the whole time, and see if you can do that comfortably and increase the range of motion. So even when you get to the top, you still have to make sure your back and your hips are pushed against the wall, that you're not really arching and compensating there. So those are a couple that you can start doing right now, especially if you felt any kind of restriction or unevenness from side to side. Start with some of the Eldoas. Start with the angels on the wall there, or even on the ground if it's really tight for you. You can do the same movement on the ground. That's easier. Then seated is a little bit more difficult, and then standing is the most difficult. But all this to say, most of the time, and again, not a therapist, not a doctor, not trying to diagnose you, most of the time though, when there is complaints about the shoulder, it's not necessarily something atomically wrong in the shoulder itself, but there's other chain reactions in the kinetic chain that are causing it for the shoulders to then take the brunt of it and then get hurt. So if we can develop better mobility around your shoulders, that's going to help alleviate those issues. And importantly for us, as we're swimmers or work with swimmers, get into better positions in the water specifically for that catch. And here's something that I've really been thinking about the last year, 2 years or so, is you want to treat your mobility work the same way you would with your technique work in the water. Now, I'm sure, depending on programs and how you do it, it may not be technique every day, but I would be willing to bet there's at least some technical aspect that you do in the water every day. Maybe it's just thinking about your turns coming off the wall better. Maybe it's how dolphin kicks you're doing off the wall, or maybe it's where your hand entry is. Treat your mobility work in the same way, especially with your shoulders. They're so dependent on your success in the pool. It makes sense to make sure you're doing something every day. And even if it's something as simple as the Eldoa stretches, just do A, B, do some wall angels, and then you're good. And that kind of stuff can help keep this at bay. But the more you can unlock your mobility on land, the better it's going to be in the water, especially when you're trying to get into that early vertical forearm position. I love Benjamin Franklin's quote too, in terms of just naps prevention. This is what it takes in terms of mobility, guys. It doesn't take a lot. It's really more consistency. So even just pick 2 or 3 of those exercises I already showed you. We'll send out a replay of this webinar. You can rewind it, go back, watch it over again. Even if you just did 2 of these every day, take less than 5 minutes out of your day, that's going to help significantly here. Now, here's where I was alluding to earlier. Hold on, get a drink of water here. With the stretching, these are our rules of stretching that we always want to be aware of while you're doing any of those mobility movements, especially the Eldoas, because they can get pretty intense. If you cannot breathe, number one, we have real problems. Breathe throughout the movement, and 2, smile. If you are not doing this, you're really not gaining much from the stretching. You're just kind of torturing yourself for not a lot of benefit. And the reason we want to do this is the nervous system dictates what it's doing by breathing and how it's responding, or how it's monitoring the breathing, I guess I should say, is a better way to put it. And that then affects your movement. So if we can kind of trick the nervous system a little bit, because the nervous system is always going back and forth between fight or flight or rest and digest, right? And so when we get in these positions where you already have restrictions or you don't have the greatest range of motion, we almost want to give a cheat code a little bit to the nervous system and say, hey, it's okay. We can relax a little bit here because the nervous system is king. What's going on up here is dictating a lot of what your muscles are doing. Yes, your muscles are sending sensory back to the brain and it's figuring out from there. But if we can kind of trick the brain a little bit and be smiling and breathing, the brain is going to start to relax those muscles and all the structure around it. And that's where we can really get some benefit. The other thing too, again, I couldn't put too much into this webinar. We'd be here all day. But how you breathe is important too. And all I'll say is make sure you're trying to think of the breath coming more from your belly than from your chest and shoulders. So even in those crazy Eldoa positions, sometimes they're a little bit difficult to get into, you still want to be focusing on, is my breath coming from my belly, or is it coming from raising the shoulders, raising my chest up? We want to move to belly breathing in this as much as possible, while continuing a steady breath and while smiling. So that's the mobility side. Now let's go to the strength side, which I'm sure most of you need to improve on. And this comes back to, I say this in almost every webinar, this is how we tie Dryland back into transferring gains in swimming. So the position is the mobility that we already talked about. Now let's talk about the tension, the strength side of it. And then the thoracic spine is actually where a lot of the musculature around the shoulder originates here. So I'm not going to go through all these muscles. Don't worry about memorizing them. If it's a lot of words on the page, I apologize. But I just want you to appreciate how much musculature is around the shoulder. Look at how many layers of musculature is around the shoulder. So obviously we're looking at the back here, the posterior side, and you can even see when it just goes to the shoulder blade there on the right side of the picture, that there's a lot of musculature even just around the scapula. That's really deep, but then there's more superficial muscles on the left side there with the traps and the deltoids, and even the lat is somewhat superficial. So on the front side, again, a lot of musculature pretty deep and coming off around the ribs. So we're in the front view now. And then even the biceps brachialis, which crosses the shoulder joint, goes all the way down and then crosses your elbow as well. So when people say, oh, it's my shoulder, see about all these options that honestly could be a factor in why the shoulder isn't able to move or function the way it should. And this is the picture we showed a little bit earlier, but what it's called is upper cross syndrome. And just in general, right? If you're looking at your screen a lot on your computer, you're probably going to be closer to poor posture anyway. But put swimming on top of that and the math of swimming that we already talked about, it's no surprise a lot of swimmers are looking like this, right? This upper cross syndrome. Now, where we get into trouble, and we talked about where do injuries come from, you think the swimmer there that's showing the upper cross syndrome, you think there's some imbalances there in terms of his body position versus where an ideal body position should be. Now, that in of itself doesn't cause the shoulder injury, but what happens is then when we go onto the gym floor and we start to do exercises, now we have this, and then we talked about this being a technical issue in the core webinar a few weeks ago, this scapula winging here. Okay, and that plays into shoulder injuries when the scapula is getting pulled in a direction it's not supposed to normally go. It's a little bit more extreme. That starts to affect the movement of the scapula. And the reason that's important, if you look at the picture just under the Surge Strength logo here, you see the degrees of freedom in each part of the arm relative to the shoulder based on the scapula moving. So what this means is that the scapula needs to move a lot more relative to the head of the humerus. If the scapula can't slide back and forth as easily as it should, or in the range that should, you have to get the movement from somewhere. And that's where it starts to go to the head of the humerus, the shoulder. And that's where you start to, oh, that hurts. I get that pain right in there. Oftentimes it's because the scapula isn't doing its job. So then the head of the humerus is the area the body tries to get movement from, but it's not structured to take on that kind of stress. And this simple example is where a lot of swimmers develop shoulder issues, is because the scapula isn't moving. So then we go back to the upper cross syndrome. You think that has anything to do with it? Look at the position of the scapula. It's already way out of position from an ideal. And there's no way it's going to get that range of motion that you would want to then help the head of the humerus and to not get it beat up. So all this to say in a very long-winded way that pushing overhead, pressing exercises, things like that in and of themselves do not cause shoulder injuries. What causes shoulder injuries is if you come into a situation, you do an exercise that you don't have the prerequisites for in terms of how well your shoulders are moving, what's your posture like, what's the specific exercise, what's the load. That's where we start to get into injury zones here, okay? And the other thing that ties into the previous webinar, the core webinar we did a few weeks ago, is the better your bracing capabilities, that translates into better pushing and pulling exercises, especially when we're talking about presses overhead. That's really dependent on if you need a strong core. And so if you're already a little bit weak, your scapula can't move very well, and you're swimming 250,000 laps a year, no wonder there's shoulder injuries. So if we start to take care of some of these variables and just lessen them a little bit, we're not going to swim 0 laps a year, right? That's not a variable we can change, but we can change. What's our posture like? Can the scapula move? Can we get a little bit better range of motion? Can we have better programming in how we're doing our Dryland exercise and the balance of exercises in that? All these things start to add up the same way your strokes that you're taking each lap add up to almost 1 million strokes a year. So let's dig into some pushing exercises that are really going to help strengthen the shoulder. You see at the bottom, though, when we're talking about requirements for the pushing category and some of the issues, lack of shoulder function and mobility is an issue along with core strength. So some of you, I kind of did a crescendo in terms of easy exercises going to harder ones. Some of you may not get past halfway before you would need to stop because you have so much issues in terms of lack of core strength or lack of shoulder mobility that some of these exercises could actually put you really in the middle of an injury zone and have some issues with your shoulder. So it's not that they're bad exercise, it's just they're not very appropriate for you right now. So here are 2 really beginner exercises, and you may not be understanding, especially the weighted carry one, how this helps with the shoulder. But the suitcase carry, the suitcase carry is the one where he just is carrying the weight by his side. Even just making sure is your shoulder kind of slid back and in position rather than being forward and being pulled forward by the weight. That's probably the most beginner place you can start in terms of get 10, 20, 15, 30 pounds, somewhere around there, and just make sure shoulders are rolled back, you're nice and tall, and you're just walking. Now, one step above that would be the weighter carry. This is where you'd want to get a weight and build up to the point where you could get a weight heavy enough that you would need to use 2 arms to push it up. And now in the weighter carry, you want your shoulder to be sunk down. So it's not pressed up. Sink your shoulder blade down. That's in a great position. And now just by walking, what's going to happen in this exercise is all the little stabilizer muscles around the shoulder that I've already showed you are going to start to fire up. And that's how we can slowly increase strength in the small stabilizing muscles around the shoulder without stressing them or being worried about the shoulder being in a poor position, and we're going to do more harm than good. So these are probably the most basic exercises I would start with. So if you're really super tight, this is probably as far as you need to go in terms of strength exercise. Here's one level up. So now we start to add movement to the presses. So we're in a kneeling position, and also going back to core strength is related to shoulder function and your pressing ability. The more narrow you can have your lunge base, the harder it's going to make the exercise. Why? Because now it's depending more on your core strength to keep you steady. Whereas if you make your stance wider in your lunge, that's a lot easier on your core. And so all you're doing is just pressing up and down and staying in a pretty narrow hallway with your arm too. So you're not trying to go out far in any direction, but just staying really narrow here. Here's another one, and this could probably be before or after the previous exercise. Either way, it kind of more depends on the weight. And you can use a couple of implements with this. So I'm doing a sandbag here. You can also do it with a kettlebell or even with a dumbbell. And it's really just making that halo movement around your head. You still want to keep tall posture, and you want to start off with the weight more lighter than you think to just make sure you can move, because it's all about the movement of what the head of the humerus and the scapula are having to do in order to get that object around your head. And then we get to more the end point, right? This is where we can really have some fun. But the problem is some of you are jumping into exercises like this, or just as worse, totally avoiding any overhead movements, because a weak muscle is much more likely to get injured, and it can't help keep it in the position that it needs to in terms of the bones and the joints. So while a lot of you may have restrictions and this is not a good exercise now, if we help cleared some of that up and gained more mobility, this is an excellent exercise. And actually, swimmers that can do these effectively are much less likely to have shoulder injuries because they can actually strengthen their shoulder. So now let's go to the opposite movement category of the push, the pull, and scroll all the way down. Look there, same requirements and issues that we had with the push: lack of brace strength, core strength, lack of shoulder scapula position. These are going to affect these exercises, but in the same token, if you take it slow and steady, it will help you overcome them. Oh, and I have to say, big pet peeve here. This is not the type of pulling I mean, especially in stretching. This, please stop doing this if you are. It's almost doing no good. And if anything, I would argue it probably does more pain or more damage than good. So these are actually the type of pulling exercises I want you to do. So this would be one of the more remedial ones, beginner level bat wing. Not a lot of movement at all. You can do it with a dumbbell or a kettlebell. You need a bench to lay on. And all it is just driving your scapula together, pinching them as hard as you can, and you're trying to push your elbow up as high as possible. Once you do that, you want to make sure you're lighting up all your musculature down the back of your spine, even into your butt, even lifting your legs up a little bit off the bench. The posterior side of almost all swimmers is underdeveloped. And so this is specifically more working on the upper part, upper middle back, but at the same time, we can get a little bit more all the way down through the rest of the posterior chain. This is a great exercise, really, no matter what level you are. Even if you do this right before like pull-ups, it can actually help a little bit too. So if you have shoulder issues, maybe even play around with, if your gym is right by your pool, do this just a few times to light up the musculature. And I'd be interested to see if your shoulder didn't bug you as much when you're swimming up and down, because we've lit up some muscles that are going to help it stay in better position once you get into the pool. Now, I think a lot of people have seen this exercise. It's not one that's very obscure, but it can really be changed by the intensity on where the feet are. So if he was to move his feet further and further underneath where the anchor point is, that gets much harder. So the trick to this exercise is understanding what intensity should you be at to do about 6 to 8 reps. And you could see here, you need some core strength, right? If you're really weak in the core, your hips are going to be moving around. You're not going to be in a straight line as you're coming back and forth. And with pulling exercises, there's the tendency to think about my hands a lot. Where's my head? As much as you can, be thinking about lighting up your back, pinching your scapulas together, driving your elbows back. The more we can light up that musculature that we were also doing in the bat wing, this is where you get more out of this exercise, especially if you're thinking in terms of how can I improve my shoulder health and get them stronger. Then we go up from rows to now we do assisted pull-ups. So maybe a lot of you can't do pull-ups. Maybe some of you can struggle out and get 1 or 2. This is a great time to use an assisted band, super bands. You can find them anywhere online. And there are a couple of variations. So this one, putting the foot in, is a little bit easier because it stretches the band out even more. And then a little bit harder version would be putting the knee in the band. You can do either. Just realize that it does change the intensity of the workout slightly. But pull-ups are also a great way to make sure shoulder injuries stay at bay. It's rare that I've seen a swimmer with shoulder issues that can do 5, 10 or more pull-ups. Usually the swimmers that have shoulder injuries can't do hardly any pull-ups, can maybe barely hang on to the bar, and have a weak core. So if shoulders have been an issue for you, let's work on that. Let's work on your pull-up strength. Let's work on your core strength. And those things over time are going to help keep shoulder injuries at bay. That's the thing when we, especially with teams, we've had a few teams start with us with our Dryland programs, where the first thing the coach said to us was, I got a lot of kids with shoulder issues, guys. And we said, okay, like, I think this is going to work. Just give us a few months. And we don't do anything magic. We just are following the same things I'm telling you. We work on mobility, we work on strength, we work on balancing the programming and the variables within that. And then it's not an overnight fix, but just the shoulder issues just start to slowly go away. And then 6 months, a year later, the coach is like, hey, I don't think we have any shoulder issues. That's great. And this is a year earlier that he was pulling his hair out because the kids were getting injured. They're not able to stay in the pool, do consistent workouts. And so obviously the high end of the pull exercise is to do an actual pull-up. And so that would be the goal. If you can't do a pull-up, let's work towards that, because that's really going to help your shoulder strength and health overall. Said it a few times, alluded to this, but stronger athletes are always more resilient athletes. So if you have issues with your shoulder, don't shy away from doing things overhead or thinking that pushing or pulling is something you need to completely stay away from. It's more that you need to find the appropriate level to work, and then over time, keep raising that intensity and the intensity of the exercises that you're doing. Here's one more thing I want to leave you with before we start going to the Q&A. In terms of exercises, again, relatively, I started off with more beginner type exercise and then went up on the intensity scale. Think about this when you see exercises next time, or even when we're talking mobility exercises. Where does it fall on this continuum? Because it is a continuum. It could be more in a rehab, prehab focus, or it could be on an actual training. Let's get some results here. What does this exercise look to you? It depends on the background. It depends on her injury history. It depends on her training goals. This exercise may look more like a training exercise to you, a rollout with a TRX, pretty intense, but depending on his ability, it may be more in the middle. It may not be even stressing him that much. Maybe he can do a wheel rollout all the way full standing. And so therefore the TRX isn't that hard. So don't automatically pigeonhole movements and exercise as, oh, that's just prehab, rehab, or, oh, this is actual training. It is a mix. It is a continuum, and it's all based on where you are. And we figure that out by assessments and tests. And then that dictates how we do the programming. So there's a lot of stuff with the shoulders. I tried to get through as much as I could here, and we're going to jump into Q&A. But first, I want to know, what did you learn today? I really enjoy hearing back from you. It helps me think of how to do future webinars as well. So throw in the chat right now. I take a drink and just take a breath here. What did you learn today? All right. Roger said importance of mobility. What else, guys? Alan, I appreciate that. Discouraging the crossbody stretching. All right, there we go, guys. Thanks. Oh, progression for strength. Yeah, absolutely, Teresa. Michael, the stretches were new to me. Great. Glad you joined the webinar today. Make sure you watch the replay when we do it and check out the YouTube channel. You'll see a lot more of these as well. Raj, breathe and smile. Yes. Working on mobility. All right, guys, second webinar in a row. My dad's joined. That's awesome, Dad. Keep it up. How was swim practice today? I'll catch up with you. Cynthia, Aldoa series for sure. All right, who else do we got? Jonathan, the importance of having prerequisites in place. Min, bracing for sure. And a lot of people don't think about the bracing ties to your shoulder health. Yep, the contrast between pressing, pulling exercises for mobility. A lot of people just go straight to stretching, and that's only half of it, maybe even a third of it. So you're really missing the boat if you're just thinking about stretching and nothing else. All right, guys, that's awesome. Thanks for your feedback. So now the question is, now that you have some of this information, and a lot of you said, hey, I learned something new. I forget who said, all those were new exercises for me. That's awesome. So now you have to decide, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to say, hey, I waste an hour of my time, now I'm doing nothing after this? Or are you going to try to go it alone, maybe figure it out, hopefully not injure your shoulder again or have that creep up? Or you can use our resources, this webinar being one of them, our YouTube channel, podcasts, and we have some really cool things I'm going to talk about in a second. But first, the programs. We've been onboarding a ton. I mean, we're hiring new coaches to try to keep up at this rate. So thank you for all of you that tuned in the last webinar. And if you've been onboarding with us for programs, that's awesome. We're excited to help so many swimmers and teams out there. But this is a great way to start. We had a podcast a few weeks ago with Maddie, who's a sophomore, junior in high school, was ready to quit swimming. And then she had us for Dryland. And then in a year later, she's got her first future cut and she's excited about swimming in college. Or this other swimmer that we worked with had a plateau, no best times for almost 4 years, went to college, we worked with him. Now he was doing 4 strokes a lap in his 100 breaststroke, completely obliterated his previous personal best and broke through. Or master swimmers, love working with master swimmers. Just talked to a master swimmer we onboarded yesterday, Jim, 65, loves to longboard, loves to swim. He's like, I do 0 Dryland, Chris, so this should be easy. We'll just add it into the program. And now he's going to go off and he's really excited about what he's going to be able to accomplish working with us. And then even Ernie and Bernie, who've been with us for 15 plus years now at this, celebrate their 72nd birthday, did 72 pull-ups on the day of their 72nd birthday to celebrate. I love hearing stories like that. So if you want more information on our Dryland programs, getting started with us, go to our website, scroll down to the program section. There's a quick form you can fill out. And then you can schedule a free call with me and we'll talk through the options with that. Here's the exciting thing I want to tell you about. So last webinar, we introduced these Dryland plans in the Surge Strength Academy. So this is very different than our custom Dryland programs. And I know not everyone can afford it. It can't fit in your budget, especially on a reoccurring basis. So the plans are a one-time fee. And then what we give you is workouts. So it's not going to be completely customized like the program, but we give you workouts for that. So the last webinar, we introduced the core training Dryland plan. And today I'm introducing the shoulder health Dryland plan. So with this one, what it's going to entail is injury prevention, number 1, basically how to make sure your shoulders are not holding you back, but actually helping you go forward in your swimming progress. It's going to be shoulder mobility exercises, my favorite ones, the progressions even within mobility. That's not something everyone thinks about, how to progress mobility exercises. They think about progressing strength exercise a little bit more. And so we go all into that. You're going to get access to the videos. I coach you through it, all the technique, especially things like the Aldoas and stuff like that. There's a lot of little fine techniques that you might not always pick up on, and you're losing potential on the table because you're not doing all these little details. So we're going to lay out all that. And the whole goal is to prevent shoulder injuries so you can train more consistently, harder, day in and day out. I don't care if you're doing ultra short race pace or you're doing 20,000 yards a day or somewhere in between. The bottom line is if you can't train consistently day in and day out and your shoulders are a cause of it, that's holding you back. And so that's what this Dryland plan's goal is to help make sure that shoulders are not an issue for you and we turn them into a strength in your swimming. So I'm actually going to put that link in the chat here. Give me 1 second so you can go directly to it. And it's similar to the core one in that I am finishing up working on it. The core one took me about, I think ended up being 10 days from the webinar to finish. I've already started on it, just need to finish up a few things, but safe to say, I'm going to say 2 weeks from now, it'll be fully ready. But in return, you get a discounted price right now if you sign up before we actually launch it. So the goal for me is within 2 weeks from today to have it live. I'll probably have it earlier than that, but better to be safe. I'm trying to push out the timelines a little bit more, but it is at a discounted price from now until when we open it. So go check it out. All right. So just to kind of reiterate, I always like to be honest with you guys on the webinar. If you are this type of person, still just kicking the tires, not even sure if you want to do the 101, obviously the shoulder plan is not for you. First, do some 101s, guys. Get in the Dryland 101 for swimmers, coaches, parents, whatever best fits you. That's on our website, surgestrength.com. If you're looking for magic, honestly, guys, I would raise the price a lot more if we had magic results. The magic is really in your consistency but you need to make sure you're doing the right things consistently. And I think that's where we come in. We'll show you what to do. It's your job then. You got to put it to work. I mean, we don't have success stories with clients like the one I recorded a podcast with today because she was just sitting around getting workouts from us and not doing them. She's putting in the work, but we're helping direct it to make sure she can do it. And I doubt this is any of you because you're on this webinar to learn, but if you already know it, then don't worry, move on. But we've continued to see success with this approach in Dryland. And I really think shoulder health is a critical thing that we need to make sure we address as swimmers, as coaches, even as parents, making sure your kid can swim as long as they want and enjoy it. And that doesn't mean you need to turn into an Olympian like Colin Jones that I worked with, getting him to do pull-ups with 80 pounds around his waist. You think his shoulders were stronger as a result? Absolutely. Didn't have any shoulder issues. Mark Gangloff, he is doing an amazing job at UNC and was instrumental in my Dryland growth because he challenged me so much in all the things we were doing with him and the other group of swimmers that Cullen was with to get to those Olympics in 2008. And so all of this is continuing to evolve over time. And we see it with results even as recently as Maddie getting her first futures cut, Ernie and Bernie doing 72 pull-ups on their birthday. So, all right, guys, Q&A time. We've got about 10 or so minutes. So fire them away and we'll get through as many as we can here. Hold on one second. Just going to reorient my side so I can see the questions a little bit better. And I'll put this up so you guys can remember what the address is. I put in the chat as well. Again, the discount will go until the Dryland plan is actually live. All right, so fire away those questions. Hayes, good to hear from you. What role does trigger point release play in prehab or rehab? Should it be part of your daily work? Hayes, great question. So trigger point is definitely in the mobility category that I would say. And here's something to think about that I think is even a bigger umbrella than trigger point. So healthy muscles need to be flexible. They need to be able to move. They need to be strong, and they need to be pain-free. And I'm talking the actual muscle. So if all of you right now, let's just take your bicep as example. I think this would be a good example for everyone. Take your bicep and just try to pinch the top of your bicep there. Pinch it fairly hard. I'm going pretty hard here. That shouldn't elicit pain, just putting that pressure on it. If there is pain when I did that, that's a signal to me, ooh, there's something going on in that muscle. And it may just be that it's been really tired, worked hard. There's maybe some waste product still in there from a past workout, like I was doing, a lot of bicep curls or something in a good pump. But the trigger point, Hayes, kind of comes into that helps to start to clear stuff like that out of the muscle. So then there's not as much pain. So the goal in trigger point is actually not to get it as painful as possible. This goes back to the rules of being able to breathe and being able to smile. Rather, the trigger point is really doing what's called a pin and stretch technique move. So a lot of masseuses use this or other chiropractors, physical therapists. And what the idea is you pin the muscle down and then we try to get some range of motion and then we get an effective stretch out of it. So long way to say, Hayes, absolutely, it's good. Just make sure you know how and why you're doing what you're doing. And especially, I've seen a lot of people incorrectly just go at it with things like trigger points, foam rolls, other things like that, where there's almost some sadistic thing of like, how much pain can I handle? And if we go back to our rules of stretching and how to be effective, you gotta be able to smile and you have to be able to breathe. So those actually go counter to that. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're doing that. Oh man, guys, tons of questions. Okay. I lost my place. Give me 1 second here. Thank you for the questions. Keep them coming. All right. Robert, Dryland plan for shoulder and core, separate. Yes, they are going to be separate plans. And so the discount for the shoulder is there till it's live. The core discount went away because it is now full and live. And if you're in the academy, you'll be able to see it and get it, even if you didn't get it prior with the discount. But it is live and completely finished now. David, how many different Dryland programs do you have? Yes, so core and shoulders, and then we're working on a couple more to come out throughout the summer and fall. So again, these are more standalone They're not customized, but there is progressions. I do go into the theory of it as well. So I pull a few lessons from the Surge Strength Dryland curriculum, but for the most part, it is new videos, exercises, me walking you through whatever the topic is. And so I just finished the core one completely, about 75% done with the shoulder one. And then we have a couple others that we'll be working on. All right. What other questions we got here, guys? Keep them coming. We got 5-6 more minutes here. All right, Will, what should a very tall, slender 12-year-old do for shoulder conditioning? New swimmer. So, Will, I would take a little bit from each of the sections I went over. So again, we're sending out a replay, watch it again. I would take a couple of the Aldoa mobility exercises, and you can find more on our YouTube channel as well. Just make sure you're doing 2 or 3 a day. It doesn't need to be a lot. It's really more that ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And if you stay ahead of it, especially with something like shoulders. So at 12 years old, you're not doing nearly the intensity that you're probably going to be doing in the pool in your 15, 16, 17, or college years if you swim in college. So start early, keep ahead of it, and especially when growth spurts start to come too. Then I would do the same thing with some of the pulling and pushing exercises. Start at the very beginning ones, just doing, a waiter carry down and back, and work your way up to being able to do pull-ups. And then with pushing or the pulling, I would definitely do bat wings and stuff like that. All right, what else we got? Cynthia, the arm across the body stretch has been one of my favorites. Is there any easy stretching recovery, not lifting exercise I could do to replace it to relieve tension I feel after swim training? Cynthia, great question. So I don't deny that it feels good, right? But just because it feels good doesn't mean we need to do it, right? Or that it's beneficial to you. So what I would do is a tennis ball. So if you go on our YouTube channel, and it is, the name of it is escaping me right now. I think it's just shoulder mobility plus tennis ball with a little plus sign. And just type in shoulder mobility. And what it is we put the tennis ball back behind your scapula. And going back to Hayes' question, it's very similar to a trigger point therapy type thing. It's a pin and stretch essentially, where the tennis ball keeps the shoulder blade in place. And then you're moving your arm around. And the whole point is for how the ball is, it's going to start to help the scapula actually get more mobility over time because it's pinned it down and it's stretching the muscles around the scap that usually get really tight. The other thing is you could take a foam roll, usually like half a foam roll, put it along your spine and just lay on it and start to open a little bit because it's also the front too. So when the front is pulling forward and we get that upper cross syndrome, actually pulling from your back, there is a sensation of, that feels better, but it's actually making the problem worse and it's a compounding effect. So as much as you want to listen to your body, sometimes you can't just go by that. You need to make sure you understand the theory behind it and why is it feeling this way and what's happening. So those are a few examples, and check out the YouTube page for more. All right. Keeping the questions coming, guys. A few more minutes. I'll get through as many as I can here. Robert, when would you say to work in the mobility exercise for those in Dryland? Crossbody syndrome is about 70% of the issues for swimmers in particular ages, yet 14 to 16. So honestly, Robert, I would do it all the time. I would even say it's worth 5 less minutes in the water, maybe even 10 every practice to do those type of stretches before you jump in the water, and even better if you can do it after. So for swimmers that have real bad shoulder not impingement, but shoulder restrictions, and just they don't have the great mobility, I would sandwich all their sessions. I would sandwich their water sessions and I would sandwich their dryland sessions with even just 5 minutes of some Aldoa movements or other mobility movements that I've gone over. And then also at the end, it's really just a matter of frequency. So don't think anything is going to happen by doing it 3 times a week for 5 or 10 minutes. That's probably literally going to do nothing. It needs to be an everyday thing and probably a couple times a day for you to really get traction on it and see results. The other thing I would say is, this just takes a little bit more time and vetting, is actual manual therapy is really helpful to break through on that. I know Karina is actually, it's the next question. I know Karina is actually a licensed physical therapist. I bet she would agree with me on this, is sometimes you just need someone else to go in there and help break some stuff up so that then it gives you a runway to keep doing more on your own. And especially if you think of, you already have swimmers with years and years of just not only the math of swimming, but now they're out of position, they're on their phone, all this. It just helps sometimes to get some other things as well. The other thing I'll say, and I've been playing around with this of late, is I just went and got one of these massage guns. Brand, it doesn't even matter, even the size of it. I actually went for the smallest one possible because I didn't want a heavy thing to hold. And I'm probably going to start doing something with this in terms of maybe put out some more lessons or something. But I've been really working on, especially around back here, trying to get into my lats and stuff like that. And this is similar to the rules of stretching we talked about earlier. We're about breathing, smiling. You also make sure you're not like just grinding on it the whole time. The point of stretching and mobility is not to inflict more pain, but to help open you up. All right, guys, I'll try to get through a few more questions here. Karine, what are your thoughts on eccentric pull-ups to build strength versus banded? Yes, perfect, Karine. And I mean, you've seen that in the Surge Strength Dryland curriculum too. I just picked that for just an example, but absolutely the drop down version. So drop down pull-ups and drop down push-ups, always a great option to build strength in those particular movements. David, so the cost of the Dryland plans going forward without the discount is $99. And right now the shoulder one is discounted to $79. So you can buy the core one right now. And that's not a problem. And then the shoulder one, you can buy at a discount right now. It's just not going to be live for at least 1 to 2 weeks. All right, a couple more questions, guys. Renee, any difference between Dryland for older kids compared to a child? Absolutely. I have so many lessons on this about in the Surge Strength Dryland certification. I'll give you the quick answer though, Rianne. When they're 12 and under, it's kind of the line in the sand for me is 12 years old. So if they're 12 and under, I'm focused on as big of a movement range as I can get. Bear crawls, forwards, backwards, sideways, skipping, jumping, lateral skipping, backwards skipping, as much movement exercise dynamically that I can put. That's what I want, because I want them to have great movement literacy. Once we get above 12 and I understand and they are eager to do strength training and I understand they want to, then we actually start working on external resistance and building up the progressions. Teresa, is there a specific rhythm you teach for pin and stretch? So I really just go by feel on that and making sure you do the breathing and the smiling rules right. And in general, I would say at least a 30-second hold, but I don't think you need to go minutes on minutes. This is where you really need to get in tune with your body. When I'm personally doing it, I wait until I feel some kind of release. And sometimes it's bigger and sometimes it's pretty subtle, but as long as you're following the rules of breathing, smiling, you're not staying on it for like 3+ minutes or something like that, that should be a fine rhythm. Cynthia. Oh yeah. Got the tennis ball on the sock. Yeah. So the double one is a little bit different. So don't do the double one on your shoulder. I haven't tried that. I don't think that'll work as well, but the single one will be good. All right. Andrew, next open enrollment is likely going to be in the fall. So as long as you, Andrew's asking about when the next open enrollment to become Surge Strength Dryland certified, because we only do that a few times a year. It's probably going to be in the fall. Your best bet is to go surgestrength.com/certification, go all the way down. It still looks like the button to buy, but it'll be a pop-up form. Enter in your email there and you'll be the first one to know when we do open it up again. All right, guys. Thanks for all the questions. It's a great session. We got another webinar. I think it's actually 2 weeks from today. I have to look at the calendar. You'll get an email about it. We're going to be talking about pull-ups, how to get better on pull-ups, how to improve that. If you can't do any, how do we get you to your first pull-up? If you're 5 or 10 pull-ups, we'll even talk about where it goes from there. So thanks for a great session, guys, and we'll see you next time.